you were here last week, you know that we covered the period of time that essentially 12th and 13th centuries, beginning roughly the year 1100 and going up till just before the year 1300, which generally speaking is most famous for the Crusades, which we were trying to summarize at that time. 7 Crusades in all, more or less the overarching kind of dominant theme, I would say, for that period of time. However, during that time, there were 3 amazing personalities. And so I want to go back now and cover the same 2 centuries, but focusing more on these 3 people. 2 of them this morning, and the other of them we'll look at next week. One of them comes at the beginning, one of them comes more or less in the middle, and the other is, as you might say, the climax toward the end. The first is St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who begins this time. He was born in the year 1090, which is just 5 years before the First Crusade. So he just comes on the scene, really, at a time when that crusading spirit was dominating culture. And so whatever we think of all of these people, we need to realize that from their point of view, this was just the reality of the time. Nevertheless, we might go back and look somewhat critically at some of them, but we need to at least have some appreciation that at the time, this was more or less taken for granted as the appropriate engagement of the church, although even at that time it certainly had its critics, as we've already mentioned. Midway through the period of the Crusades, toward the end of the 12th century, going into the 13th century, is St. Francis of Assisi. We'll be looking at him as well this morning. So the first 2 will have our interest this morning. The next week we're going to look at the third of these individuals, the towering theologian and genius in the history of the church, Thomas Aquinas. And so those 3 really stand out, almost bigger than life, and give us some happier things to think about and talk about as we're reviewing the same period of time. So this morning we're going to be spending half our time roughly on St. Bernard of Clairvaux, half our time on St. Francis of Assisi. And I want to just say to you at the outset that 20 minutes for each of these is not adequate. So you realize that this is doing a grave injustice to both of them, but for the sake of our time frame and budgeting our time, this is the way we'll approach this. We'll spend all of our time next week then on Thomas Aquinas. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, we are deeply grateful again that as the church goes through her periods of time of sometimes being very heroic and doing great things and sometimes being engaged in activities and projects that are less than the Christian calling would seem to suggest, that nevertheless you give great gifts to your church, great men and women throughout history who have been focal points of evidence of your grace. And as we look at the individuals that come before us this morning, we thank you for their lives. We thank you for the way in which they form an encouragement for us. And we pray that our consideration of them this morning would be guided by your Spirit, and that as a result of it we would ourselves rise to the higher calling that you have placed on each of us. And it's to that end that we commit these moments together now in the name of Christ. Amen. Bernard of Clairvaux, of course, is a name I'm sure all of you recognize, and you may or may not have some degree of familiarity with Bernard of Clairvaux. He is, of course, famous because he founded and was the first abbot of the convent located at Clairvaux, which is in France, of course. Usually we think of a convent as largely populated by female nuns and so on, but the word can also apply to a community of male monks, and monks are usually male, and so that would follow. But nevertheless, so this is not a monastery exactly. There wasn't a huge building, that kind of thing, but nevertheless it was a community of individuals who had given themselves to the monastic order, and Bernard was the first abbot of the convent at Clairvaux. He doesn't escape his age. I mentioned to you last week that he was one of the chief advocates for and organizers of the Second Crusade. Many people would look back on his life and criticize him for that, and I'm trying to be as gentle as possible, and I hope you realize that given the fact that that was the culture in which he was born, it's a lot to expect of someone to absolutely distance themselves from the prevailing spirit of the time. Nevertheless, in spite of that, he does, in a sense, rise above the culture in which he was born. There's one contemporary commentator who makes this comment about him, quote, "In his countenance there shone forth a pureness not of earth but of heaven, and his eyes had a clearness of an angel's and the mildness of a dove's eyes." He was a great man in his time. He was a famous man. He was not one of those people that, we figured out 100 years later what a great person he was. But even during his life, he was recognized as one of the greatest personalities alive then. He died very famous and yet very humble, and represents one of those great pictures of Christian heroism in church history. He has several different areas in which he was prominent. He's a versatile personality in that regard. He was regarded as the greatest preacher of his age. He combined a striking ability to kind of adjust his sermons to his audience. Not so much in their content. He was always faithful to the gospel message in that respect. But if he was preaching to a relatively unsophisticated group, those who lacked education, were not necessarily versed in the more technical details of theology, he could easily adjust his sermon so that it reached them, and he would use the popular vernacular and even somewhat what we might regard as coarse language in order to reach those who needed to hear the sermon in a message that would kind of grip their hearts. At the same time, if he was preaching to a congregation or a group of people that were academically sophisticated, he could easily ratchet up the style in which he himself spoke so that it was appropriate to whatever group he happened to be addressing. This is one of the more well-known features of his preaching and his ability. He was one of the most important, in fact, maybe the most important counselor to several popes during his lifetime. He was a close confidant of the papacy. As I indicated, he was important, especially with respect to the Second Crusade, and I want to come back to that a little bit later on a side point. He is famous because he inaugurated one of the schools of medieval mysticism. You may have varying, attitudes toward mysticism. It may provoke, any number of different impressions in our minds. But at the time, it was a bit of a reaction to a highly rigid and kind of formalistic form of Christianity that had become common. And he was really calling the church and Christian people back more to an understanding that the life of faith is really a life of relationship and knowing Christ in some sort of personal, experiential way. And that was at least a very legitimate aspect of the mystical movement for which he was quite famous. He was important, of course, generally in the monastic reforms. We talked about 2 weeks ago how in the monastic movement the Cluniac revivals and others had reacted against some of the unfortunate and tragic corruption that had beset the ecclesiastical hierarchy during those late years, the 10th century into the 11th century. Bernard was a very important reforming spirit in that regard, and so he's remembered for that. He's important for the hymns he wrote. I'm going to review one of those with you a little bit later, but he gave many hymns to the church, and the hymnody of the church has been greatly enriched by the contribution that he made along the way. So in all of these ways, you can kind of see that he was a very versatile mind, a great mind, not necessarily restricted to one particular, as they sometimes say, vertical market, in the church, but he was rather very broad and had a great ministry on many different fronts. He was born in 1090, as I say, 5 years before the First Crusade. He was born of a noble family in France. Early in his life was distinguished by a high degree of religious interest, so much so that by the time he was 22 years old, he was prepared to enter the monastic life, and at that point took the vows of the monastic order, entering the convent at Citeaux. He adopted early at that time, that is at that initial beginning of his life as a monk, one of the most severe and rigid forms of monastic self-deprivation, so much so that he himself regretted it later. He felt that his actual health was negatively impacted by the severity with which he would fast and involve himself in this kind of severe self-discipline and asceticism. Nevertheless, that at least characterized the first few years of his life as a monk. I might mention, by the way, just as a side note, Martin Luther makes the same comment. Before his conversion, he also was a rigidly severe monk and adopted all kinds of ascetic practices, which he felt did impair his health all the rest of his life. He rather regretted it at a later time, similarly to Bernard. Bernard, nevertheless, in spite of the rigors of the monastic life that he had adopted, still at the same time was able to study widely. He was a very good student. He not only familiarized himself with classic Christian teaching and learning, but also many of the pagan and classical authors that come from outside the Christian world were also familiar to him, and he would easily and casually quote from them in his various sermons and other writings and so on. But probably he's most famous because of the deeply contemplative life that he adopted, and becoming something of a founding genius of a sort of contemplative, mystical sort of tradition that became very important in his life and afterwards. He so distinguished himself early on that within about 2 or 3 years, he was commissioned to become the abbot of the convent at Clairvaux. So having only been a monk for about 3 years, he was immediately catapulted into a position of some leadership because of the quality of his life that was so apparent in the way that he lived. Clairvaux was not exactly a desirable place to set up a community of monks. It was, in fact, called popularly at the time Wormwood, which is borrowed from the New Testament and the Old Testament, and it means bitter or a bitter place. If I could think of a contemporary counterpart, it might be putting up a monastery in the midst of a drug culture, gang warfare, violence, crime type of situation. It wasn't exactly a place where people went just to have a lovely time. Nevertheless, just almost immediately, that location began to reflect the influence of Bernard and those that followed him, so that one observer made the remark after just a few years, quote, "Now the hills began to distill sweetness, and the fields, before sterile, blossomed and became fat under the divine benediction." This, by the way, is a great lesson for us, that sometimes, while we certainly need police force and so on, sometimes the best way to rid a neighborhood of the criminal element is just put up a center of worship. And that will, by the nature of the case, have that redemptive impact. And we see that many times in church history, of which this is only one example. Bernard's ministry was very broad, as I've already intimated to you. Especially his sermons, as I already suggested, had that remarkable ability to reach people wherever they might be in terms of their social station. Martin Luther, who was not particularly positively disposed toward the monkish life, having been there and done that, he was pretty critical and pretty skeptical of what he viewed as a kind of superficial holiness associated with what he viewed as the typical monkish life. Nevertheless, had the very highest regard for Bernard, viewed him as a true Christian's Christian. He said of Bernard in his preaching, quote, "Bernard is superior to all the doctors in his sermons, even to Augustine himself, because he preaches Christ most excellently." And Luther had a pretty sensitive truth detector at that point, and so his accolades to Bernard are really rather remarkable. He also made this statement about Bernard, quote, "Bernard loved Jesus as much as any man can." So that's Luther's comment concerning Bernard. He was important in the life of the church. He went on many errands on behalf of the Pope and others during his time. He was kind of a conciliator, a peacemaker in many different regards, entered some of the thorniest kinds of disputes and was able to bring peace in many occasions. But probably the thing that most distinguished him was his establishing a kind of contemplative, meditative school of thought that really focused on the humanity of Christ. He not only, as I indicated earlier, advocated the Second Crusade, but he actually went with this group to the Holy Land. This was, you recall, if you were here last week, during the period of time that's called the Latin Kingdom in Jerusalem. It was when Jerusalem was under the control of the West, And so while on that crusade, Bernard actually spent a considerable amount of time in Jerusalem. And while there, visited some of what we would, commonly call the holy sites, places where various things that are recorded in the New Testament, were said or done, that kind of thing. But Bernard was particularly impressed and indeed deeply impacted at that point by the impressions related to the humanity of Christ. This was especially life-changing for him because he, as we often do, tend to accent the deity of Christ or the divinity of Christ and almost cause him to lose his true humanity. This is called Docetism, and we have a lot of neo-Docetism throughout church history, when the deity of Christ is emphasized but the humanity is obscured or neglected. And Bernard felt that he himself had done that, and to be those places where Christ had lived and preached and so on, to become impressed with the poverty of Christ, with the fact that he was so human, with the fact that he suffered. All of these things led Bernard in the direction of establishing a kind of discipline of reflecting upon the life of Christ and the humanity of Christ and the suffering of Christ. And this became very important in the history of the Catholic Church in particular, the so-called Stations of the Cross, the Via Dolorosa, other mental exercises that have been more important in the Catholic tradition than they have with us Protestants, and probably that's to our loss, in which the suffering of Christ, the human experience of Christ in these various moments of his life are really brought to the mind and made a focus of some attention. These were all very much a part of Bernard's concern. One of the more interesting features of Bernard's story, and I'm just going to tell you this without necessarily trying to comment either way, judge either way, but there is almost universal testimony that there were many miracles that took place in connection with his ministry. Now, I'll just tell you honestly, I'm as much a product of my age as probably any of us, and anytime I start hearing about miracles, I get a little jumpy, and I'm a Presbyterian, you know how that goes, and so whenever I hear about, especially from the medieval period, miracles taking place, then I get even more skeptical. But in the case of Bernard, I have to say I'm impressed with the testimony, because not only were the witnesses friendly to Bernard, but even his enemies tacitly acknowledged that there were miraculous events that took place in connection with his ministry, mostly miracles of healing. Even Bernard himself, in a kind of almost reluctant way, will mention that. It seems as if it was such a well-known feature of his ministry that he was expected to say something, but he never played it up. He never, said, come to, the big deal service, XYZ time and that kind of thing. None of that. He was very modest about it, almost a little embarrassed about it, and yet it was such a prominent part of his reputation and so on that it seems to have come to us with a high degree of credibility. So I just leave that to you. It's part of his story, and certainly anyone that reads about the life of Bernard is going to be dealing with something of that, a little piece of it as well. He was not a soaring theologian in the sense of an Augustine or an Aquinas. He didn't really rise to that level, but he was a very able defender of Orthodox Christianity. Probably his chief adversary in his lifetime was a man by the name of Peter Abelard, who was right at the edge of orthodoxy and really questioned things like the Trinity and certain other basic doctrines of Christianity. And Bernard was a very capable defender and apologist for the Christian faith. He made one remark about Abelard at one point that I thought was interesting. He said of Peter Abelard, he sees through a glass darkly, and all he sees is the darkness. So this was his assessment of Peter Abelard. But nevertheless, he did give some helpful thought and contribution to the church in that regard. He sounds very Augustinian when he begins to talk about issues of human corruption. He talks about the human will being utterly enslaved to sin and incapable of moving to the good unless empowered to do so by the grace of God. At that point, he really escapes semi-Pelagianism, which had become pretty much the order of the day in medieval Christianity, and is really much more of a reinstatement of the Augustinian theology, which again, of course, was revived heavily at the time of the Reformation through Luther and Calvin, and on the Catholic side, Pascal and certain others. He denied the Immaculate Conception of Mary. That particular doctrine had not been officially defined in the church, but it was widely accepted. And so again, this, I think, speaks well to his theological insight, that he doesn't simply follow in the track of ideas that have become more or less commonplace. He doesn't find warrant for it and thus denies it. He also denied, interestingly, that baptism was an indispensable prerequisite to salvation. He certainly believed that baptism was absolutely important and essential, and that anyone who would despise baptism would do so at his or her peril. But he doesn't go so far as to say, you cannot be saved unless you are baptized. You see, he shrinks from that. He believes that God's grace is sufficient to even overrule deficits in the ministry of the church or any individual person's circumstance. He does, in a way that is really virtually unique for his time, rise above the kind of violent atmosphere of the culture, even within the church, and accent some of the higher virtues in a way that is virtually unprecedented at that time, particularly the notion of love for God, love for Christ, love for one another. Beautiful statements and writings come from Bernard in that regard. I'll just give you one little quick one here to give you a sense of the kind of character of it. He says, quote, love seeks no cause nor end but itself. Its fruit is its activity. I love because I love, and I love in order that I may love. Love is the only one of all the sense movements and affections of the soul by which the creature can answer to its creator and repay like with like. And those kinds of statements from Bernard are very characteristic, in which he raises up a whole new way, really, of thinking about the Christian faith that in some ways was quite foreign, in many cases, to the culture of the time. His preaching was especially oriented to the Old Testament. There has been a tendency throughout church history to neglect the Old Testament, at least at some times. We certainly live at a time in church history when the Old Testament tends to be neglected. Much of the preaching of Bernard came from the Old Testament. Especially, he loved the Song of Solomon. And he was one of the first ones to really formulate a kind of allegorical approach to the Song of Solomon, in which it becomes descriptive of the love relationship between Christ on the one hand and his people on the other. Bernard is also distinguished at this point that at a time when it was virtually taken for granted that Jewish people deserved brutal and ghastly treatment, which is, of course, a big black eye in the history of the church, that the church has been responsible for that attitude more than once and from time to time. Bernard really rose against that and criticized it convincingly, saying that this is not the way, you see, the Jewish people should be treated. His fascination with the Old Testament led him to the corollary principle that these people in some ways religiously are our next of kin, and that rather than treating them so harsh and in such a violent way, we should be appealing to them based on their own Old Testament. We should be, calling their attention to the way in which Christ is so vividly portrayed in the Old Testament texts, and that would be a vastly more Christian and a proper way for us to appeal to these folks. Unfortunately, those efforts on the part of Bernard were not overly influential in his time, but it certainly speaks to his credit that he raised that issue in that way. I indicated to you earlier that much of the hymnody of the church was influenced by Bernard, and there are many hymns that come down to us, really. If you just notice the author up there, you'll find his name shows up. But there's one in particular that is familiar to all of you that I'd like to just conclude our conversation about Bernard by reminding you of these wonderful words. This is the hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded, which is comes from Bernard, and because sometimes I don't think we sing this hymn all that often. I can't remember the last time we've sung it, and sometimes when we do sing it, we don't really think about the majesty of the words. So I'd like to just have you listen to these in connection with our little recitation concerning his life. He writes, O sacred head now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded with thorns, thine only crown. How art thou pale with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn? How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? What thou, my Lord, hast suffered was all for sinners' gain. Mine was the transgression, but thine the deadly pain. Lo, here I fall, my Savior, 'tis I deserve thy place. Look on me with thy favor, vouchsafe to me thy grace. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. These remarkable words. In fact, I've asked, this is one of those occasions in the hymnody of the church in which great words were eventually married to great music. And I've asked my son Kyle if he would just give us a reminder of the music that was became the setting for these words from Bach to just remind us of that. So, Kyle?
It's number 98 in our hymn book.
If you'd like to, follow along, number 98, as Kyle plays it. Go ahead. Thank you very much. There are occasions in church history when great words are married to mediocre music. And then sometimes when great music is married to mediocre words. But this is and sometimes mediocre words go with mediocre music. That happens. But this, in my opinion, is one of those occasions when great words were joined with great music and becomes one of the classic expressions. All right, let's shift gears then and take a look at the life of St. Francis of Assisi. Bernard died about the year 1150, and it was some 30 years later then, just midway through our period of the Crusades, when the next great light on the horizon comes along, who's known as Francis of Assisi. He is also in the contemplative tradition, as was Bernard. Becomes involved in what came to be called later passion mysticism. In some ways, picking up that theme that we've already talked about in Bernard, but even going further. Francis was not the versatile mind or the great church, politician, if I can use that expression, that Bernard was, but he was certainly a soaring spirit. And it's appropriate that we should remember him for his greatness in that more narrow kind of constraint. He wasn't a great academic. He wasn't a great theologian. We don't have, great writings from him, apologetics, that kind of thing. But just in terms of a man who has a passionate devotion to knowing Christ and serving him, I think no one could doubt the depth of who he was and what he accomplished. He was very, again, severe in his devotion to this passion mysticism, and again, there's been some argument that may have led to his early death. He died at the ripe old age of 44 years old, and that in itself is remarkable, to have an individual who would leave such an imprint, and we'd be talking about him now 600 or 700 years later, and yet he only lived those short 44 years or so. His early life was distinguished by a very difficult relationship with his family, and particularly his father. Last week I mentioned to you that one of the side effects of the Crusades was it created a class of people, a kind of middle class, that became something of the nouveau riche at the time. They were able to engage in commerce and mercantile and so on, and some small wealth began to be accumulated, and Francis' father was one of those individuals who became quite a wealthy cloth merchant. But Francis himself, while he grew up then surrounded by some degree of opulence, comparatively speaking, that is with reference to the culture of the time, nevertheless was always kind of a misfit. And there was a very strained relationship with his father throughout his years of growing up. He also didn't have much time for Christian thought or Christian faith. He had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with the church, kind of like Augustine had years earlier. Being drawn in some ways to the faith, and yet at the same time a life that was more or less taken up with a bunch of childish pranks and acts of rebellion and that sort of thing. Typical teenager, was basically the life of Francis, and his father just went crazy. He wanted his son to settle down, to become a good heir to the business, and Francis just wouldn't fit in to that mold. Finally, the father, in frustration, decided what any probably good father would do under those circumstances: get that boy into the army. And so he actually had him enrolled in the military at that time when he was in his late teenage years. And in that regard, he was involved in a local skirmish there, going to battle, and was actually captured and spent 1 year as a prisoner of war. And in that year as a prisoner of war, his life utterly and radically changed. For the first time in his life, he was forced to live without all of the comforts. He was reduced to radical poverty, as it were, eating just the most minuscule diet and dressed in the harshest of clothing and living in the most forbidding of circumstances. And all of that impressed upon his mind that most of the people in the world were living basically the same way. That all that had happened in this prisoner of war situation was that he had all of a sudden been pushed into life as it is normally for most people. As I say, after a year, he was released from the prisoner of war camp. He came back a different man, really now much more devoted to seeking a life of Christian service and pursuing the life of monastic piety again. It was at that time, or shortly thereafter, that he felt he heard the call of Christ on his life, framed in the famous words that Jesus gave to the rich young ruler, which you recall, the rich young ruler, heard the words from Jesus: "Go and sell all you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven." And Francis felt that in some peculiar and particular way, those words were addressed to him, and that's what he was being called to do. This was somewhat difficult for Francis because he had always, frankly, hated the poor. He didn't like the sight of them. He didn't like to be around them. Particularly the diseased poor troubled him. He didn't want to even be associated in any way with them. Particularly the diseased poor that had leprosy, which was not uncommon in those days. And as he came back from his experience, he was moved deeply with a sense of guilt over the way he had had this feeling of being of abhorring, really, and despising those who were in that circumstance of life. And so in order to somehow or other get himself over that, he actually sought out and lived for a while in a leper colony and struggled with it greatly. But finally, the whole thing was climaxed one day when he finally reached out and touched and embraced and kissed one of these people who had been horribly disfigured by leprosy. And for him, that was something of a life-transforming moment and really set his path in a different direction as a result. It was also during that time that he felt he heard the call of God in his life, framed almost in these words, that he should rebuild the fallen house of God. That was the words that he reportedly heard, that he was to rebuild the fallen house of God. Now, he took that quite literally, because there was in the vicinity where he lived a church that had been heavily damaged in one of the local skirmishes and was in fact laying there more or less in ruins, partly destroyed. And he believed that the command to him was in particular to be about the business of rebuilding that house. And so he grabbed a hammer and nails and whatever and went and started going to work on it. But the thing he didn't have was money. And of course, to rebuild it properly would take a certain amount of money. And it all of a sudden occurred to him that his father had lots of money. Now, he wasn't sure how open his father would be to the strategy that he had adopted, so he just did a little self-help at this point. He went into one of the warehouses of his father, in which he had his father was storing some of the expensive cloth he'd imported from the East, was planning to sell in his various retail. I think it was the Gap was actually what he ran then, and so he had this clothing there and was ready to put it on the market, and Francis just found his way into that and stole a bunch of it. That's all. He just took a bunch of this cloth, took it out, sold it, and used the proceeds in order to go to work on this church. Well, as you can probably imagine, Francis' father was not happy. This was not, he didn't say, oh, my son, the monk, I'm so proud of him. That was not exactly his response. He was so furious. I mean, this was like the straw that finally broke the camel's back. He was so furious he went and had his son arrested, brought him home, and actually confined him physically in the cellar of the house. And so now for the second time in Francis' life, he was a prisoner. Only this time he was a prisoner in his own house. And he was there for some time, again, eating the most humble of food and living in the most unhappy of circumstances, until finally his mother was sort of moved with compassion, as mothers can be, and she finally secretly released him. And he sneaked out and once again began his life of service. Well, his father was just fit to be tied and actually brought suit against his son. There was a big public trial. And at this public trial, his father not only publicly disinherited his son Francis, but also was demanding from him repayment, restitution for the value of the cloth that had been stolen by Francis. Well, at that moment, in a kind of dramatic way, Francis asked permission to be excused for just a little bit to kind of go into a private situation, which he did. And then he came back just a few minutes later, essentially naked, just having a little loincloth on. All of his clothes, all of his earthly possessions, everything he had, jewelry, everything, money, he brought it over and laid it at the feet of his father. Then he stood up and looked at his father and said, up until this, words to this effect, up until this time I have called you my father. From now on I have but one father, my Father who is in heaven. And he turned and walked away, and the rift with his father was permanent from that point on. Which leads me to an interesting little footnote here. I'll just make this comment in passing, how frequently it is that these people who rise to greatness in the history of the church have difficult family relationships. It happens again and again. In fact, we're going to see next week with Thomas Aquinas. He was put under house arrest for a while, locked in a room. Same idea, and so I don't know how to account for that. I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm just making a little historical observation. But I think some of us who are parents, when we have children that seem a little bit wayward, a little bit problematic, maybe we should have some context and perspective here. Maybe, this is greatness, and we're just needing to have a little bit of slack at that point. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll leave it to John and Michelle Estelle to tell you about parenting, but nevertheless, it doesn't impress me that we see this from time to time in church history. This all took place about the year 1209, and upon this rift with his father, Francis took the very rough garment, kind of the sackcloth garment of a monk, and had emblazoned on the back a big image of a cross. And of course that became famous with the Franciscans, this image of the cross that was emblazoned on the back of the garment. Francis wanted to start a new order of monks, and he wanted them to be different because rather than being cloistered together in a community and kind of living in this private, secluded way, Francis was particularly impressed, as we've already noted, with the need for their service to be made available, as it were, in the streets. And so he wanted a new order of monks that would not live together in a monkish colony, but rather walk the byways, the highways, providing service. And so friars would be the name that would be associated with them, brothers who were there providing service. He went to the Pope at the time, Innocent III, and proposed that the Pope would sanction this new order of monks. Now, Innocent III it just so happened, was increasingly distressed at that time with the proliferation of new orders of monks. He just about had it up to here with new orders of monks. And so he drew the line. He said, no, there's enough. There's plenty of orders of monks. Go join one of them. And he wasn't prepared to let Francis start this new order. And so Francis left somewhat dejected from that initial rebuff. But meantime, Innocent went to bed that night, and as the story goes, was plagued all night long. Couldn't sleep, but constantly had visions of this beggar standing at his door who bore a striking likeness to Francis. And as he looked at this image of this beggar at the door, he saw again and again in the image, in the vision as it were, that this beggar was holding the entire church on his shoulders. And he was so moved by that the next moment he sent servants out to look here and there, trying to find Francis. They did find him, brought him back, and the paperwork necessary to inaugurate a new order of monks was given to him. And so the Franciscan order really originates from that time, and that was characteristic of their lives. It really was characteristic of Francis that he deeply loved nature. He was a man that loved to be out there in association not only with people, but the natural surroundings were especially attractive to him. And many stories come to us concerning Francis that describe this, but probably one of the most famous is his so-called Sermon to the Birds. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's so much fun that I just can't do better than to read this little piece of the story to you that comes from an eyewitness, one of the disciples of Francis from later in his life. And so if you don't mind, let me just give you this account of his Sermon to the Birds. And St. Francis saw some trees by the roadside, and in these trees there was a multitude of birds of all kinds, such as never were seen before in this region, and a great quantity were on the ground under the trees. And when St. Francis saw all the multitude, the Spirit of God came over him, and he said to his disciples, "Wait here for me. I'm going to go preach to our sisters, the birds." And he walked into the field up to the birds who sat upon the earth. And as soon as he began to preach, all the birds who sat in the trees flew down to him, and none of them moved, although he went right up to them so that his cowl touched several of them. But St. Francis said to the birds, "My sister birds, you owe God much gratitude, and ought always and everywhere to praise and exalt him, because you can fly so freely wherever you want to, and for your double and threefold clothing, and for your colored and adorning coats, and for the food which you do not have to work for, and for the beautiful voices the Creator has given you. You sow not, neither do you reap, but God feeds you and gives you rivers and springs to drink from, and hills and mountains, cliffs and rocks to hide yourselves in, and high trees for you to build your nests in. And though you neither spin nor weave, he gives you and your young ones the necessary clothing. Love therefore the Creator much, since he's given you such great blessings. Watch therefore well, my sister birds, that you be not ungrateful, but busy yourselves always in praising God." But after this, our Holy Father's word, all those little birds began to open their beaks, to beat with their wings and stretch out their necks and bow their heads reverently to the earth. And with their song and their movement showed that the words of St. Francis had greatly pleased them. But St. Francis rejoiced in his spirit as he saw this and wondered over so many birds and over their variety and differences, and that they were so tame. And he praised the Creator for it and greatly exhorted them to praise the Creator themselves. And when St. Francis had finished his sermon and his exhortation to praise God, he made the sign of the cross over all the birds. And all the birds flew up at once and twittered wonderfully and strongly and separated and flew away. So I'm just going to leave it to your own critical appraisal, the account, but it certainly does seem well attested that Francis was one of those remarkable figures that did have a kind of rapport with nature, and especially with birds, that made him famous in his own time, and of course famous right down to the present day. Another phenomenon that's associated with Francis, which again is one of those mysteries that I can't offer much comment on, I just report it to you, and you can take it for whatever you want to. It's this, that Francis is numbered among those who are called in church history the stigmati. Now, if you know that term, the stigmatization phenomenon, which is not only true of Francis, but there are actually numbers that are reported through church history, has to do with the mystical tradition in which people became so focused and penetrated so deeply in their contemplative reflection on the life of Christ, and particularly the passion of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ, that over time their body actually began to reflect the marks of crucifixion. Not because they actually submitted themselves to it literally, but apparently just through the mental focus and so on, it began to occur that they would show the marks in their hands and feet of the so-called stigmatization, and these people are called the stigmati, and Francis was one of them. And again, if you don't mind, I'd like to just read a brief little text that gives us some report concerning that. But now after the wonderful vision had finally disappeared, an excessive glow was left in Francis' heart. And in his body the vision left a wonderful image and imprint of Christ's sufferings. For at once in his hands and feet marks like nails began to appear, so that they seemed perforated in the middle, and the heads of the nails were within the palms of the hands and on the back of the feet. And the points of the nails were on the backs of the hands and under the feet, and they were bent over so that there was space between the flesh and the points of the nails for a finger, as if in a ring, and the nails had a round black head. And so in his left side the image of a lance thrust appeared, red and bleeding, out of which blood often issued from Brother Francis' breast and saturated his habit and clothes. But Francis said nothing of this to the brothers, but hid his hands and would not put the soles of his feet to the earth any more. And the brothers found that his habit and clothes were bloody when they went to the wash, and then they understood that he bore the image and likeness of our Lord Jesus Christ, the crucified, in his side, and likewise on his hands and his feet. Now again, I cannot offer any comment on that. If there are psychologists and psychiatrists among us who want to speak to that, I certainly welcome it. But I will simply say this from a historical point of view, this does occur. And so it's one of those things that has to be at least recognized in terms of the record. How we explain it, what exactly it means, has been, of course, as you can probably well imagine, the subject of many different interpretive efforts as well. I've got about one minute left, and I want to read you a very quick little piece that comes from the end of his life, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions here. So this is really the account of the death of St. Francis in these words again. Towards evening he began to sing with unusual strength. It was no more the sun song, but the 141st Psalm of David. As the October evening fell rapidly and grew dark in the little hut, Francis prayed in the deep stillness among the disciples, listening breathlessly. And then the quote here from the 141st Psalm that I'll skip over for the sake of time, although you might want to take a look at that. It concludes with these words, "Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The just wait for me until thou reward me." While Francis prayed, it was quite dark in the little cell, and as his voice ceased, all was still as death, a stillness which this voice was never more to break. Francis of Assisi had closed his lips forever. He went into eternity singing. But as a last greeting to the departed singer of God at this moment, over and around the house, there was a loud and sudden twittering. It was Francis' good friends the larks who said their last farewell. So there's the eyewitness testimony of the death of St. Francis. Two remarkable figures, Bernard of Clairvaux, Francis of Assisi, great gifts at a time which is not the happiest chapter in the history of the church. These two men give us hope. And so I hope this has been useful in your own reflection on that point. Next week we'll look at Thomas Aquinas, who is the towering intellect, wonderful theologian, great gift to the church.